the craft of life really looks at generational aspects of memento, and there are three sort of pieces or bodies of work. There's a study of hair that I made in 1998, 2000, on my father, the hair that dropped out, which I'll talk about later. Then there's my son's first haircut, and which is obviously very precious to parents and to me as a father. And then I did a self-portrait of myself to signify the idea of how, as a male, one, A, is grooming themselves, B, I would say also a sense of identity. But I must also say that even though in the portrait I have long hair and it's a top knot, which signifies my Sikh background, I have not taken the Amrit to be a Khalsa Sikh. So the question is, why have I got the top knots? I think I'm going to be very frank and say, aesthetically, I think visually it was quite appealing to me. But then also, I think fundamentally underneath all that, as a metaphor, it does relate to the extended sort of image of Sikhs. But I'm going back to some of the early photographs from the 1800s and from India. But generally, when you see a Sikh, their hair is covered by a turban. And as a young Sikh, one would have the actual shape of the top knot covered by a handkerchief, hence the word, the top knot. And that would be fixed with an elastic band quite crudely. I do remember in the 70s meeting friends or extended family where they would have this square handkerchief wrapped around the top knot and a band or an elastic band placed on top. So going back to the series, it is a generational thing. So the collecting of hair, historically, memento mori, it becomes precious. We all want to keep a sense of one's loved ones who have passed away or left a photograph, a memory in your wallet. Now you have photographs on the screen that you can scroll through to keep an idea or a sort of a connection. But with someone that has passed away, even though you have photographs, and I made photographs of my father as he was slowly deteriorating through chemotherapy, the one thing that you notice is, and even as we age, the hair, specifically, say, in my hair, black to a sort of an interesting looking shade of grey, and those grey tones suddenly change to white and maybe to silver. But collecting the hair was quite cathartic and therapeutical for me. And it wasn't just the hair that was collected at the time when my father was having chemotherapy. And historically, I think this has become a ritual with many different families, many families that go through this process. So the nurses would collect the hair for me, put it into bags. They would also collect other debris that fell off my father as he was lying in the bed. And even now, when I open the bags that the hair is contained in, I could smell. I don't think I could smell my father anymore. I smell the chemotherapy, unfortunately. But then that hair has stayed. It hasn't faded like a photograph. The memory hasn't faded. The hair itself has, when I break the hair and pull it apart on the table or on a white sheet of paper, when I go back to it to explore and rephotograph it, it glistens. It glistens the way the light hits the strands of hair. But the hair itself is for me, has become very precious, but to photograph it is a document of the hair and the way I place the hair, the different strands, the bulkiness, the density of the hair. It's almost as if you're placing your fingers in the hair and taking out the knots. And those memories are quite important to me, because as a child, watching my mother comb my sister's long, beautiful black hair, it was quite ritualistic when you're sitting there, and obviously my sister was in pain and my mother used this sort of brush, and she took about 3 or 4, 5 minutes just brushing the hair, and it was a beautiful ritual. And occasionally the hair would be coated with a fine oil, and then it would be plaited and ready to go to school. But coming back to my father's hair, I think it was also this idea of the ritual, the process, because obviously the chemo was not successful, and he unfortunately passed away. But the hair itself now is, well, to some extent, has become immortalized, because it's been published in a book titled Illustration of Life, where you see photographs of my father and the hair. And it's been very close. It is very close to me, the hair. And when my son was born, I'd made a note, mental note, that his first ever haircut I would collect. And again, this is generational thing. So when one looks at a family archive, you would have 2, 3 generations, I think, if one is lucky, of family, if they still survive or living. But to have the hair becomes a metaphor, a portrait. So the triptych, the first triptych, is my father's hair, and the second one is of my son's hair. And again, that's loosely placed. But then also you can see within the hair the thick black density of this beautiful blackness of my son's hair. It does look youthful compared to my father's hair. That has, one can see the history through the strands, the different strands of hair, and one can actually sit and write a whole story about just looking at the hair. It reminds me of a novel by Calvino called Mr. Palomar. Mr. Palomar is based on a telescope in South America, and there's a chapter in there called The Infinite Lawn, and it describes, there's a man sitting on a deck chair looking at the lawn, and it just discusses how to cultivate a beautiful lawn. And again, it's a metaphor for the many conversations that I've had with my father. He was obsessed by gardening. And just by looking at the strands of grass, the beautiful green grass, one can tell many stories. And it's no different, I would imagine, looking at these strands, these fine, thin lines, and then bulky clumps of hair, where each section reveals something of my father's history. I think that presenting something personal, I think one, within working in art, I think the one thing I found, and also being involved in face, and which has really brought this idea of vulnerability and one's lived experience front and center, and the testimonies and the conversations that we've had over the 2, 3 years now, 4 years even, it's been quite extraordinary. And it's also quite vulnerable. It's vulnerable, but they're also painful, that we came together through an act of trauma that was witnessed. But these traumatic acts happen, I would say, quite regularly, and some are documented, some are not. Some are sort of the trauma takes place unseen, unheard, and time goes by, and there is trauma and vulnerability with and the level of vulnerability within in what I have done, because the hair itself, collecting one's hair, memento mori. It's a Victorian tradition as well. Lockets of hair kept as in pieces of jewelry and embedded in books. I've got a student who's doing some work around her own identity, and she's actually created this doll. She's created her own doll based on her own identity. And in the doll, she's placed some of her hair. And I was really taken back by that. It actually, I was quite startled by it, because hair, or collecting one's hair, has many different connotations in different cultures and backgrounds, for many different reasons, good reasons, bad reasons. Magic comes into it. But the vulnerability of this, and looking at this, it reveals a story. So it can be reading one's palm, a hand, and one reading the hand. And I remember having my palm read, and it was almost, the person was sort of saying that certain things will happen in my life. So the hair itself, placing my father's hair, and looking at the flow, the texture, the pieces are seen as a triptych. There's a few other photographs, and more recently, I've been making different types of sculptures in spheres. I've attached the hair and made them into little balls and suspended them, so that as if they're floating. And it is an element of our body that is material. It as we age, it falls out of your body, and as I said earlier, there's one is defined by the hair as well. Your identity changes through your hair, and the revealing of the stories is really important, because the hair itself, it's a pattern. It's almost like a Rorschach effect. You can see things in the hair if you want to. You don't have to. Lying on your back on the grass, looking up at the sky, at the clouds, one can make up many narratives and stories.